The rattle of the stagecoach was a constant torment, a bone-jarring rhythm that had defined Abigail May's world for weeks. It was the sound of her new life, a violent, unceasing shudder that promised nothing but the unknown. Outside the dusty window, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory stretched on forever, a sea of brown grass under a bleached blue sky. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and brick townhouses of Boston, a world she had fled with little more than her nursing kit and a fractured heart. The engagement to Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose hands were as cold as his ambition, was a lifetime ago. Breaking it had been the first true choice she had ever made for herself, an act of rebellion that had propelled her westward, toward a freedom she could only imagine. At 23, she felt she was finally beginning to live. The coach lurched, throwing her against the worn leather seat. Across from her, a portly salesman mopped his brow with a graying handkerchief, and beside him, a woman in a severe black bonnet clutched a Bible to her chest, her lips moving in silent, fearful prayer. They were all strangers, bound together by the shared vulnerability of the open prairie. Abigail clutched the handle of her medical bag, the worn leather a familiar comfort. This was her purpose, the one thing she was certain of. Not marriage, not society, but the simple, profound act of mending what was broken. A sudden crack, sharp and definitive like a whip, split the air. It was not a whip. The salesman's eyes went wide. Another crack followed, and a splinter of wood exploded from the window frame inches from Abigail's head. The woman with the Bible shrieked. The driver's frantic shouts from outside were lost in the thunder of galloping hooves that seemed to come from all directions. The stagecoach skidded sideways, its wheels screaming in protest, before it came to a groaning, violent halt. Abigail's first glimpse of Western violence was a chaotic blur of dust, sweat-slicked horses, and the grim faces of men whose eyes held no light. They were highwaymen, their faces masked by dirty bandanas, their hands wielding pistols with a terrifying casualness. The door was ripped open, and a man with a jagged scar across his cheek leveled his gun at the salesman. His voice was a low growl, demanding valuables, his words punctuated by the nervous whinnying of the horses. Abigail felt a strange calm descend upon her. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but her training took over. She scanned the scene, her eyes cataloging injuries, assessing threats, a habit ingrained through countless hours in the emergency wards of Boston. It was then she saw the movement at the edge of the road. A small wagon, traveling with their coach for safety, had been overturned. A Lakota family. The man and woman lay still beside it, but a child, a small boy no older than 5, was crawling from the wreckage. His leg bent at an unnatural angle. A thin cry escaped his lips, a sound of pure pain that cut through the bandits' coarse shouts. One of the outlaws, seeing the child, raised his pistol. Time seemed to slow. Abigail did not think. She acted. She scrambled out of the coach on the opposite side, her bag clutched in her hand. The salesman yelled for her to get back inside, his voice thin with terror. She ignored him, keeping the coach between herself and the man with the gun as she circled around to the overturned wagon. The boy had collapsed, his small body shuddering. Blood was seeping through his deerskin leggings. The world erupted in a volley of gunfire, but it was not from the outlaws. A posse of riders crested the nearby hill, their rifles blazing. The ambushers, caught by surprise, returned fire, and the air filled with the deadly whistle of lead. Abigail threw herself to the ground beside the boy, shielding his small form with her own body. She could feel the vibrations of the bullets hitting the earth around them. It was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining bandits spurred their horses and vanished back into the vast emptiness of the prairie, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder and the silence of death. The posse rode down, their faces grim. Abigail pushed herself up and immediately turned her attention to the child. His leg was broken, a clean snap of the tibia. As she opened her bag, pulling out splints and clean linen, one of the riders from the posse, a thick-necked man with a face like sun-baked leather, dismounted and strode over. He looked down at the child, then at Abigail, his expression a mask of contempt. He spat on the ground near her feet. He said that she was wasting good medicine on a savage whelp. His voice was thick with hatred. He said the only good Indian was a dead one. Abigail did not look up. Her hands, steady and sure, continued their work. She said that he was a child, and he was hurt. That was all that mattered. The man grunted, turning away in disgust to join the others who were checking on the passengers. None of them offered to help. They watched her, their eyes hard and suspicious, as she carefully set the boy's leg, binding it tightly. He did not cry out, but his dark, intelligent eyes never left her face, watching her with a stoic curiosity that broke her heart. His mother, who had been merely stunned, stirred and crawled to his side, her own face a canvas of fear and gratitude. She spoke in a language Abigail did not understand, but the meaning was clear as she touched Abigail's hand. Later, as the dead were being attended to and the coach was being righted, the town sheriff rode up. He was a tall, weary-looking man named O'Donnell, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He took in the scene with a practiced, tired gaze. He saw Abigail cleaning her instruments, the Lakota mother cradling her now sleeping child. The sheriff walked over, his spurs jingling softly in the dust. He tipped his hat. He said that was a brave thing you did, miss, and a foolish one. Abigail met his gaze directly. She said it was the right thing. Sheriff O'Donnell almost smiled, but it was a sad, cynical expression. He looked out at the endless prairie, the heat shimmering above the grass. He told her that out here in the West, a conscience is the easiest thing to get shot. He advised her to learn that lesson quickly if she intended to stay. The town of Dry Creek was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the wilderness, a collection of tired wooden buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vastness. It smelled of horse manure, stale whiskey, and baked earth. Abigail rented a small room above the general store, a simple space with a bed, a wash basin, and a window that overlooked the main thoroughfare. Her work was at the army fort on the edge of town, a small infirmary that served both the soldiers and the townsfolk. It was a place of constant need, of gunshot wounds, broken bones, and prairie fever. She worked tirelessly, her skills a stark contrast to the rough and ready nature of the frontier. The people of Dry Creek watched her. They accepted her help because they had to, but their eyes were filled with a deep-seated suspicion. She was an outsider, a woman from the East, unmarried, with an education that made them uncomfortable. They saw her prettiness not as a gift, but as a potential complication, a lure for trouble. Whispers followed her down the street. They said a woman like that, all alone, treating any man who walked through her door, must have an agenda. They wondered what she was running from, what she was looking for. Their curiosity was a heavy blanket, smothering and constant. Abigail ignored the gossip as best she could. She found solace in her work, in the quiet moments of healing. But she could not ignore the stories that were told in hushed tones in the saloon. Stories that drifted into the infirmary with wounded soldiers. They spoke of a Lakota warrior, a man who moved like a phantom in the night. They called him Chayton, the Falcon. The soldiers said he was a ghost, a demon who hunted them in retaliation for a past massacre, for a family lost. They spoke of his raids, swift and deadly, of soldiers found dead with a single arrow in their hearts. He was a myth, a legend born of fear and bloodshed, a symbol of the untamable wildness that pressed in on Dry Creek from all sides. Abigail listened to these stories and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the sound of a deep, unhealable wound, a grief so profound it had turned to vengeance. Weeks turned into a month. Abigail settled into a routine. The days were long, filled with the smells of antiseptic and blood. The nights were quiet, save for the distant howl of a coyote or the drunken shouts from the saloon. She was lonely, a feeling as vast and empty as the landscape around her. She missed the intellectual conversations of Boston, the rustle of silk dresses, the sense of a world ordered and understood. Here, everything was raw, elemental, and dangerous. One night, she was on duty alone in the infirmary, cataloging medical supplies by the weak light of a kerosene lamp. The fort was quiet, the town asleep. A profound stillness had settled over the land. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the frantic, muffled drumming of a horse's hooves, moving at a full gallop. It was close, too close. The sound came from the back of the infirmary, along the narrow track that led toward the river. It was not the steady, rhythmic canter of a patrol. This was the sound of flight, of desperation. Abigail froze, her hand hovering over a bottle of laudanum. She moved to the small, grimy window and peered out into the moonlit darkness. She saw nothing but the swaying shapes of the cottonwood trees. The sound of the horse faded as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the immense silence of the prairie. She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding against her ribs. She told herself it was just a traveler, perhaps a rancher in a hurry, but she could not shake the feeling of unease. Then, a new sound reached her, faint and far off. It was a single gunshot, a sharp, angry pop that echoed once across the plains and then was gone. An unnatural quiet followed, a silence that felt heavier, more menacing than before. Abigail let the curtain fall back into place. She did not know why, but a cold certainty washed over her. Something had just happened, something that would change the course of her new, fragile life. The West had just delivered a new kind of trouble to her doorstep, and the quiet of the night felt like the held breath before a storm. The single gunshot seemed to hang in the air, its echo absorbed by the infinite, thirsty plains. Abigail May stood frozen inside the infirmary, her hand still clutching the cool glass of a medicine bottle. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise. It was a weighted, watchful quiet. Her training, her every instinct, screamed that a sound like that was a prelude to suffering. Someone, somewhere, was hurt. She told herself to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for the morning patrol. That was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. Sheriff O'Donnell's words about the fate of a conscience in this land echoed in her mind. But the image of the small Lakota boy on the roadside, his eyes wide with a silent pain, rose before her. To heal was not a choice for her. It was a compulsion, the very bedrock of her being. Hesitantly, she took the lantern from its hook, its yellow glow casting long, dancing shadows around the small room. She had to be certain the medicine shed was secure. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough to propel her feet forward. She unlatched the back door of the infirmary, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped out into the cool night. The moon was a silver coin in a black velvet sky, illuminating the hard-packed earth with an ethereal light. The air was clean and carried the scent of dust and distant pine. The medicine shed stood about 30 yards away, a dark silhouette next to the deeper darkness of the communal well. Everything was still, too still. As she walked, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound, she kept her eyes scanning the shadows. Her heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She reached the shed and ran a hand over the simple wooden latch. It was secure. A wave of relief washed over her, and for a moment she felt foolish for her alarm. She turned to go back inside. That is when she saw it, a shape on the ground by the base of the well, a heap of darkness that did not belong. At first, she thought it was a bundle of discarded blankets, but then the shape shifted, a low groan disturbing the perfect quiet of the night. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She raised the lantern higher, its light pushing back the shadows. It was a man. He was slumped against the stone base of the well, his body folded in on itself. He was Lakota, his long, dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. his bare torso gleaming with a damp sheen in the lamplight. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the deerskin of his trousers and pooling on the ground beneath him, originating from a terrible wound high on his shoulder, near his collarbone. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. For a long, terrible moment, Abigail could not move. Her mind reeled. This was not just any native man. Even in his wounded state, there was an aura of power about him, a dangerous stillness. The lean, powerful muscles of his arms and chest, the sharp line of his jaw, the proud set of his head even as he slumped in near unconsciousness. This had to be him. Chayton, the falcon, the ghost of the prairie the soldiers whispered about with a mixture of hatred and fear. The man who had, according to the tales, killed American soldiers, an enemy of the fort, of the town, of her entire world. Her duty and her fear waged a silent, vicious war within her. To help him would be treason. If she were discovered, she would be branded a traitor, an outcast. She could be jailed, or worse. The faces of the townsfolk, already so full of suspicion, would harden into open hostility. Sheriff O'Donnell's cynical warning was no longer a piece of advice. It was a prophecy hanging over her head. But to leave him here was to condemn him to death. He would bleed out before sunrise, or be found by the morning patrol and shot where he lay. She looked at the wound. It was a graze, but a deep and vicious one. A bullet had torn through the muscle of his shoulder, ripping a ragged channel. He was losing too much blood. He was burning with fever. He was a human being, dying at her feet. Her oath, the one she had sworn to God and to herself, made no distinction for the color of a man's skin or the side he fought on. She was a nurse. She mended what was broken. Her decision was not a thought, but a surrender. She knelt beside him. Placing the lantern on the ground, she whispered, trying to see if he was conscious. His eyes remained closed. Gritting her teeth, she put her hands under his arms and pulled. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She strained, her own muscles screaming in protest, and dragged him, inch by painful inch, across the dirt toward the medicine shed. His moccasined feet left 2 long, shallow furrows in the dust. The effort left her breathless, her lungs burning. She fumbled with the latch on the shed, her hands shaking, and somehow managed to pull him inside, into the cramped darkness that smelled of dried herbs and carbolic acid. She closed the door, plunging them into near total blackness, save for the sliver of moonlight under the door. She retrieved the lantern and brought it inside, its warm glow creating an island of light in the small, cluttered space. She worked with a desperate urgency. There was no time to fetch proper supplies from the infirmary. She had to make do. She found a bottle of whiskey, a roll of clean linen, and a sewing kit she kept for mending torn sacks. It was crude, but it would have to be enough. With a strip of linen, she wiped the sweat and grime from his face. He was younger than she had imagined from the stories, perhaps not much older than herself. His face, even slack with pain, was strong and handsome, with high cheekbones and a firm mouth. She poured whiskey onto a clean cloth, the sharp scent filling the small shed. When she pressed the cloth to his wound, his body arched in a silent scream of agony, and his eyes flew open. They were the darkest eyes she had ever seen, wild and fierce like a hawk's. They locked onto hers, burning with a feverish intensity. For a moment, she was paralyzed by them, caught in their untamed depths. There was pain in them, and confusion, but not the hatred she had expected. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, as she cleaned the wound. His jaw was clenched, the muscles in his neck corded with tension, but he made no sound. Abigail took a deep breath, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She threaded the needle. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold it steady. She told him this was going to hurt, her voice a strained whisper. She did not know if he understood her words, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. She took another breath and pushed the needle through his skin. He flinched, a deep hiss of breath escaping through his teeth, but he did not pull away. She stitched the torn flesh together with small, precise movements, her Boston training taking over, overriding the tremor in her hands. The only sounds in the shed were the soft pop of the thread pulling through skin, his ragged breathing, and the frantic beating of her own heart. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with clean linen, her touch gentle and professional. She gave him a small sip of water from a canteen she found on a shelf, lifting his head carefully. He lay back against a stack of burlap sacks, his breathing still labored but more regular. The fever still raged in him, but the bleeding had stopped. Exhausted, Abigail sank back on her heels, the bloody needle still clutched in her hand. They stayed that way for a long time, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken questions. The lantern cast a warm, intimate glow on his face. His voice, when it came, was a low, rough rasp, cracked from thirst and pain. His eyes, clouded with fever but lucid, were still locked on hers. He spoke, his English accented but clear. He said that she fixed his bullet, Graze, and now he would fix her name. He said she would be Mrs. Mine. Abigail stared at him, her face flushing with heat. The words were so unexpected, so utterly strange, that she could not formulate a response. They were possessive, a declaration of ownership, spoken with an unnerving certainty. It was the most audacious thing anyone had ever said to her. She quickly reasoned it away. It was the fever talking, the delirium of a wounded man. He did not know what he was saying. She told him to rest, her voice softer than she intended. He closed his eyes, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion, and she was left alone with his unsettling words echoing in the small, dark space. Mrs. Mine. The phrase clung to her, a burr on her thoughts, both absurd and strangely thrilling. For 3 days, the medicine shed became her secret. Her prison, she lived a life of constant, nerve-wracking duality. By day, she was the calm, competent nurse at the fort, tending to soldiers' ailments, smiling politely at the townsfolk, her face a mask of normalcy. But her mind was always in the shed, with the wounded warrior who lay hidden among the sacks of herbs and bottles of potion. By night, she would slip out, carrying scraps of food, fresh water, and clean bandages. She would tend to his wound, which was beginning to heal cleanly, and check his fever, which was slowly receding. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, quiet phrases. He watched her with those intense, hawk-like eyes, a silent observation that made her feel both scrutinized and, in a strange way, protected. An unspoken understanding grew in the space between them. It was a bond forged in secrecy and shared vulnerability, a fragile trust in a world that would have torn them apart. Abigail found herself caught in a current she could not control, torn between the profound satisfaction of saving a life and the ever-present, gut-wrenching fear of being discovered. Every footstep outside the shed made her heart leap into her throat. Every shouted order from the fort sent a jolt of ice through her veins. On the 4th night, the fever had broken completely. He was weak but lucid. She was changing his bandage, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his chest. When the sound came, it was faint at first, a rhythmic drumming that grew steadily louder. Abigail froze, her head snapping up. It was the sound of multiple horses moving at a steady trot, a patrol, and they were coming closer, their path taking them directly behind the infirmary, past the well, past the medicine shed. They were too close. There was no time to run, no place to hide. She looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. He had heard it too. He was already pushing himself up, his body tensing, ready for a fight he could not possibly win. Abigail put a hand on his good shoulder, pushing him back down gently. She leaned in close, her face just inches from his, her own fear a tangible thing in the small space. She put a finger to her lips, and her voice was a desperate, barely audible whisper that was swallowed by the growing thunder of the hooves just outside the door. She said, "Do not breathe." The sound of the horse's hooves grew into a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small medicine shed. Abigail May held her breath until her lungs burned. Her body pressed against Chayton's, her hand still resting on his good shoulder. She could feel the tense coil of his muscles beneath her palm. Through a crack in the wooden wall, she saw the patrol pass. 2 soldiers on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the moonlight. They rode slowly, their rifles held loosely across their saddles. One of them laughed, a low, guttural sound that carried clearly in the night air. They were close enough for her to smell the leather of their saddles and the sweat of their horses. Then they were gone, the sound of their passage fading back into the chirping of crickets, leaving a silence that felt deeper and more fragile than before. Abigail let out her breath in a long, shuddering sigh. The danger had passed, but the proximity of it left a cold residue of fear in her veins. The medicine shed, once a secret sanctuary, now felt like a trap. It was too close to the infirmary, too exposed. She looked at Chayton. In the dim lantern light, his face was a stoic mask, but his dark eyes held a new awareness. They both knew this could not continue. The next day, Abigail moved through her duties in a fog of anxiety. Every conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every glance seemed to hold a silent accusation. In the general store, while purchasing a small sack of flour she did not need, she heard the men talking. Their voices were low and serious, clustered around the pot-bellied stove. They spoke of the ambush on the stagecoach, of the soldiers who had been found dead in the hills over the past few months. One man, a blacksmith with arms as thick as tree limbs, said that a Lakota warrior had been seen near the river, wounded but alive. He had stolen a rifle from one of the dead prospectors and vanished like smoke. They said the army patrol was scouring the entire territory for him. Abigail's blood ran cold. She paid for her flour, her hands fumbling with the coins, and left the store without a word. The whispers followed her down the dusty street, confirming her deepest fears. Chayton was not just a wounded man. He was a fugitive, a hunted enemy with a price on his head, and she was harboring him. That night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, she put her new plan into action. There was an old stable at the far edge of her rented property, long abandoned by the previous tenant. It was dilapidated and forgotten, its roof sagging in the middle and its doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. It was also farther from the fort, shielded by a stand of gnarled cottonwood trees. It was their only option. Moving him was an ordeal. He was still weak, and every step sent a fresh wave of pain across his face, a fact he tried to hide behind a mask of indifference. He leaned heavily on her, his arm draped over her shoulders, his body radiating a dry heat. Abigail, though slight of build, possessed a wiry strength born of hard work. She half carried, half dragged him across the dark ground, stopping every few feet to listen to the sounds of the night. The abandoned stable smelled of decay, of old hay turned to dust and the faint, musky scent of animals long gone. But it was larger than the shed, and the darkness inside felt safer, more complete. She made him a bed of old horse blankets in an empty stall, the driest corner she could find. In the relative security of the stable, a new rhythm began. Each night, she would bring him food and fresh water, and tend to his healing shoulder, and in the long, quiet hours, surrounded by the sleeping world, they began to talk. His English was halting, built of simple words, but his voice was a low, resonant baritone that filled the empty space. He told her of his home, the Paha Sapa, the Black Hills, a land sacred to his people. He spoke of it not as a territory on a map, but as a living being, the heart of the world. He described the pine-covered mountains that rose from the plains, the clear, cold streams filled with fish, the vast herds of buffalo that were the lifeblood of his tribe. His words painted a picture of a world she could barely imagine, a life of profound connection to the earth. Then his voice would grow quiet, and a shadow would pass over his eyes. He told her of the yellow metal, the gold, discovered in their sacred hills. He spoke of the treaty, a piece of paper the white men had signed and then forgotten. He described the flood of prospectors who had defiled their holy sites, the soldiers who had come to protect the thieves, and the battles that had followed. He did not speak with anger, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow that was far more powerful. He spoke of his own family, of a wife and son lost not to a battle, but to the sickness that had followed the soldiers, a sickness for which they had no name and no cure. Abigail listened, and for the first time, she began to understand. The phantom warrior, the vengeful ghost from the soldiers' stories, dissolved before her. In his place was a man, a husband and a father, whose entire world had been stolen and broken. A fragile bridge formed between them in that dusty stable. He, in turn, was curious about her. He asked her about her home in the East, a place he called the Land of Stone Rivers. She described Boston, its crowded streets, its towering buildings, its constant noise. As she spoke, she realized how little she missed it. He began to teach her words in his own language, his tongue shaping the soft, guttural sounds with a natural grace. He would point to the moon, a sliver of white visible through a crack in the roof, and say, "Hanwi." He would touch the water in the canteen and say, "Mni." Abigail would repeat the words, her own tongue clumsy and awkward. He would listen patiently, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, and correct her gently. In return, she taught him the English alphabet. She would scratch the letters in the dirt floor with a stick, and he would study them, his brow furrowed in concentration. He learned quickly, his mind sharp and inquisitive. In these quiet lessons, they were not a Lakota warrior and a white nurse. They were simply two people, sharing the small, precious pieces of their worlds. Abigail found herself living in a state of constant, gut-wrenching conflict. In the infirmary, surrounded by the blue-coated soldiers, she felt like a traitor. They were her countrymen, the protectors of her way of life. She was aiding their sworn enemy, a man who had likely shed the blood of men she treated daily. Yet, when she was with Chayton in the quiet darkness of the stable, she felt a sense of peace, a feeling of rightness that defied all logic. She felt safer with this hunted savage than she did amongst the suspicious, gossiping people of Dry Creek. He was a man of night and wind, a man of a world she did not understand. But in his presence, for the first time since coming west, she did not feel entirely alone. One evening, the sky opened up. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the dust of the town to a thick, clinging mud. The storm raged for hours, the wind howling around the corners of the stable, rattling the loose planks of the walls. Abigail had brought Chayton his meal, but she was trapped by the storm, unable to return to her room without being soaked. She huddled in a corner of the stall, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders. But a deep, unshakable chill had settled into her bones. She shivered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Chayton, who had been watching her from his bed of blankets, rose silently. He moved with a fluid grace, his injury barely hindering him now. He retrieved a bundle from the corner, something she had not noticed before. He unrolled it, and in the dim light of her lantern, she saw it was a heavy blanket made from the thick, gray pelt of a wolf, its edges trimmed with intricate beadwork. Without a word, he came to her and draped the heavy skin over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a profound comfort that sank deep into her body. It smelled of wood smoke, of pine, and of him. It was a wild, clean scent. The shivering subsided. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. The sound of the rain drumming on the old roof filled the silence between them. He did not move away. He stood before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He slowly raised his hand, not to his wound, not to the blanket, but to her. He gently, almost reverently, touched a loose strand of her hair that had escaped her bun. His fingers were calloused, but his touch was feather-light. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the storm. He said that her heart beats like a wild horse. Abigail May. Abigail's own heart leaped at his words, a frantic, galloping rhythm that proved him right. She looked into his dark, serious eyes and saw a depth of understanding that stole her breath. She found her own voice, a whisper that felt both bold and fragile. She replied, "That and yours. It does not know fences." A flicker of something surprise, recognition, something more passed through his eyes. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that had nothing to do with words or language. It was a recognition of the wild, untamable spirit in each other. He slowly let his hand fall. Abigail pulled the wolfskin tighter around herself. In that moment, her internal war ended. The lines of duty, of country, of race, all faded away, rendered meaningless by the simple, profound truth of the man standing before her. She made a new promise, to him and to herself. She told him that she would help him. She would find a way to get him a horse, supplies. She told him he could make it to Montana, where the soldiers were fewer, where he might find what was left of his people. He listened, his expression unreadable. He nodded his thanks, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw that his gaze was not fixed on a distant horizon called Montana. It was fixed on her, and she understood with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity that for him, escape was no longer just about running away. It was about what or who he might be running toward. The promise of helping him escape to Montana hung in the air of the old stable, a fragile hope in a world built of harsh realities. Days turned into a week, and a tense quiet settled over Dry Creek. Chayton's strength returned with each passing day. He moved with a restless energy now, his body healed, his spirit chafing against the confinement of the dusty stall. Abigail May saw the wildness returning to his eyes, the yearning for an open sky. She began making discreet inquiries, trying to learn the patrol schedules and the best route north, all while maintaining the placid exterior of a dedicated nurse. The disruption came on a Tuesday. Arriving in a cloud of dust and the jingle of spurs, a posse of a dozen men rode into town, led by a man with a silver star pinned to his leather vest. He was not a sheriff, but a federal marshal, a man named Gage, with a hard, square jaw and pale, cold eyes that missed nothing. He announced to Sheriff O'Donnell and the assembled townsfolk that he was leading a government-sanctioned hunt for the renegade Lakota warrior responsible for the recent violence in the territory. He had a warrant, and he had jurisdiction. A palpable wave of relief washed over the town. The arrival of Marshal Gage felt like salvation, a sign that the federal government was finally taking their fears seriously. Abigail watched from the window of the infirmary, her heart a cold stone in her chest. There was a severity about Gage and his men, a predatory stillness that had nothing to do with justice. For 2 days, Gage's men were a constant presence, questioning townsfolk, studying maps, and drinking heavily in the saloon at night. They made a great show of their hunt, riding out in patrols that always seemed to circle back to town. On the 3rd afternoon, the facade shattered. A supply wagon carrying the Army fort's payroll, a heavy chest filled with gold coin, rumbled down the main street. As it passed the saloon, Gage and his men emerged, not with questions, but with pistols drawn. The attack was brutal and swift. They shot the 2 Army guards on the wagon without a word of warning. Gunfire erupted up and down the street as Gage's men, no longer lawmen but bandits, fanned out. It was not a hunt, it was a raid. The pretense of searching for Chayton had been a lie, a perfect cover to position themselves to seize the gold. Panic seized Dry Creek. People scrambled for cover, their screams mingling with the sharp crack of rifles. Abigail ran from the infirmary, her medical bag in hand, her mind already cataloging the carnage. She dragged a wounded shopkeeper into the relative safety of the blacksmith's forge, pressing a bandage to the man's bleeding side. From the open door, she saw the town's small church, where many of the women and children had run for sanctuary, suddenly erupt in flames. One of Gage's men had hurled a torch through a window, a cruel act of diversion. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls of the steeple. Thick, black smoke poured from the windows. Through the chaos, Abigail saw a small boy, the baker's son, stumble out of the main door of the church, his face streaked with soot, crying for his mother who was still trapped inside. One of the bandits, mounted on a tall black horse, saw the boy as an easy target, a way to sow more terror. He raised his rifle, taking aim. Time stopped. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She was too far away to help. Then, from the hayloft of the abandoned stable on the edge of town, came a sound like the snap of a dry twig. It was a single, precise rifle shot. The bandit on the horse did not cry out. His rifle flew from his hands as he clutched his shoulder, a look of pure shock on his face before he tumbled from the saddle. The shot had not been meant to kill, but to disarm, an act of incredible skill. The boy, startled but unharmed, scrambled to safety. No one saw where the shot came from. In the chaos of the fire and the raid, it was a miracle, an impossibility. Later, the townsfolk would speak of it in hushed, awed tones, whispering that a guardian spirit watched over Dry Creek, an angel who answered their prayers in their darkest hour. The raid ended as Sheriff O'Donnell and a handful of armed citizens managed to mount a defense, driving the remaining bandits out of town. Gage and a few of his men escaped with the gold, leaving behind a trail of death and a smoldering church. In the aftermath, a new suspicion began to fester. As Abigail helped tend to the wounded, she felt the weight of watching eyes. The blacksmith's wife, while thanking her for saving her husband, mentioned that she had seen footprints near Abigail's rented property, the tracks of a man's moccasins, heading toward the old stable. She said it was strange, with everyone so worried about renegades. The comment was dropped casually, but its meaning was as sharp as a shard of glass. The secret she was keeping was beginning to unravel. That night, long after the fires were out and an exhausted quiet had fallen over the town, Abigail slipped out to the stable. She found Chayton by the horse trough behind the building, the moonlight silvering the scene. He was stripped to the waist, splashing cool water over his face and chest. His encounter with the bandit had not been without a price. A stray splinter from the hayloft window had opened a shallow cut on his forearm. He was washing the blood away in the trough. Abigail stopped in the shadows of the cottonwood trees, her breath catching in her throat. The moonlight sculpted the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders. Water droplets glistened on his dark skin like scattered diamonds. He moved with an innate, unself-conscious grace, a creature of the night in his natural element. She saw the intricate lines of old scars on his back, a map of a life of conflict she could only imagine. There was a raw, untamed beauty to him that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He was the embodiment of the wild land she had come to, a man who was as much a part of the landscape as the wind and the stars. He must have sensed her presence. He turned slowly, his wet hair clinging to his neck. His expression was calm, his dark eyes holding hers across the moonlit space. He did not seem surprised to see her. She walked forward, her medical bag in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She gestured to the cut on his arm. It was minor, but it was an excuse to be near him, to touch him. He sat on the edge of the trough and held out his arm. She knelt before him, taking his arm in her hands. She cleaned the cut with a cloth and alcohol, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his warm skin. He did not flinch. He watched her, his gaze intense, his presence filling the world, shrinking it down until it was only the two of them, the moonlight, and the sound of a lone cricket. She wrapped a clean linen bandage around his forearm, her movements slow and deliberate. When she was done, her hands lingered on his skin for a moment longer than necessary. His voice was a low whisper, a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the night. "He said that you fix wounds." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "He said that I fix fates." The meaning of his words settled over her, profound and absolute. He was speaking of the boy at the church, of the fate he had altered with a single bullet. But he was speaking of more than that. He was speaking of them, of the invisible thread that had tied their destinies together from the moment she had found him bleeding by the well. She looked up, and his face was very close. The world seemed to fall away. There was no town, no soldiers, no danger. There was only the intensity in his eyes, the clean scent of his skin, and the undeniable truth of what was happening between them. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she was rooted to the spot, caught in the powerful gravity of his presence. Their first kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, trembling discovery. His lips were firm and warm, a stark contrast to the cool night air. It was a kiss of shared secrets and forbidden longing, a hesitant question and a desperate answer all at once. It tasted of the wildness she had seen in him, of a sorrow she had heard in his stories, and of a tenderness she had never expected. It was an act of rebellion against the world that wanted them apart, a moment of pure, unadulterated truth in a life built of secrets. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for what had just passed between them. It was a promise, a treaty signed not with ink but with a touch, in a language older than their two warring worlds. A shout from the direction of the town shattered the spell. It was the voice of a soldier, sharp with alarm. Another voice answered. Abigail scrambled to her feet, her heart seizing with a new and immediate terror. Chayton was already on his feet beside her, his body tense, his hand reaching for the rifle he had leaned against the stable wall. They peered around the corner of the building. Two soldiers with lanterns were standing near the horse trough. One of them knelt, holding his lantern low to the ground. The light illuminated a dark, damning stain in the dust, the spot where Chayton's blood had dripped from his arm before he had washed it away. The soldier touched the spot with his finger. He looked up at his companion, his face grim in the yellow light. The town, he declared, was to be sealed. No one in, no one out. A house-to-house search would begin at dawn. The dawn broke cold and gray, the rising sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that promised a day as grim as the mood that had settled over Dry Creek. The lockdown was absolute. Soldiers stood guard at both ends of the main street, their rifles held at the ready, their face stern and unforgiving. No one was allowed to enter or leave. The house-to-house search began with the first week light, a methodical, invasive process that frayed the already raw nerves of the townsfolk. Abigail May had not slept. After the soldiers had discovered the bloodstain, she and Chayton had retreated into the deepest shadows of the stable, a silent, desperate vigil. Every sound, every distant shout, was a fresh torment. The kiss they had shared now seemed like a memory from another lifetime, a brief, impossible dream born before the nightmare began. She was in her small room above the general store when the knock came. It was not the heavy-handed bang of a soldier's rifle butt, but a firm, deliberate rap. She opened the door to find Sheriff O'Donnell standing on the landing. He looked as weary as the gray morning, his drooping mustache seeming to carry the weight of the whole town's troubles. He did not speak, but his eyes, sad and knowing, held hers. He gestured for her to come with him. He did not take her to the fort commander. He led her to his own small office, a cramped space that smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork. He closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. He motioned for her to sit in the single wooden chair opposite his desk. He remained standing, looking out the grimy window at the street below. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence was a heavy, suffocating thing. Abigail sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a carefully constructed mask of composure. She would not give him anything. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tired. He told her that a man leaves a trail, a horse, a fire, a footprint. He said a secret leaves a trail, too. He turned from the window and looked directly at her. His eyes were not unkind, but they were relentless. He spoke of the moccasin tracks the blacksmith's wife had seen. He spoke of the impossible shot from the stable hayloft that had saved the baker's son, a shot no one in town had the skill to make. He spoke of the bloodstain found by the horse trough last night. He laid the facts out on the desk between them like playing cards, each one a damning accusation. He asked her to tell him where the Lakota warrior was. He said it would be better for everyone if she cooperated. He said the fort commander was talking about burning the stable, about making an example. He was offering her a way out, a chance to mitigate the disaster he knew was coming. Abigail met his gaze and said nothing. The battle was not fought with words, but with the pressure of his stare and the unyielding wall of her silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to confess, to plead, to explain. But what could she say? How could she explain the man who taught her his language, who had covered her with his own blanket, whose sorrow for his lost world had broken her heart? How could she explain the kiss in the moonlight? To speak of it would be to betray it, to reduce it to a sordid, treasonous affair. Silence was her only shield, her only loyalty. The sheriff's patience began to fray. His voice grew harder. He reminded her of the law. He told her she was harboring a fugitive, an enemy of the United States government. He told her she was committing treason. The words were ugly, violent things in the quiet room. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. He demanded that she stop this foolishness. He said a woman like her, an educated woman from the East, had no business getting mixed up in this. He asked if she had any idea what the soldiers would do to him when they found him. He asked if she wanted that on her conscience. His last question was a knife twisting in her gut. She thought of Chayton, cornered and alone. She thought of his pride, his fierce spirit, but her face remained a placid lake, betraying none of the storm raging beneath the surface. She simply stared back at him, her lips a thin, determined line. A commotion from the street below broke the standoff. Shouts, the sound of running feet, the authoritative bark of a military command. Sheriff O'Donnell straightened up, his face grim. He knew what it meant. He looked at Abigail one last time, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. He said that he hoped she knew what she was doing. He walked out of the office, leaving her alone in the crushing silence. She flew to the window. The search party had reached her property. A half-dozen soldiers, led by a young, arrogant lieutenant, were surrounding the abandoned stable. They were moving with a tense, predatory caution, their rifles raised. Abigail's blood ran cold. She could not breathe. She had to get to him. She ran from the office, down the stairs, and out into the street. A soldier tried to stop her, but she pushed past him, her eyes fixed on the stable. The world narrowed to that single, dilapidated building. She heard the lieutenant shout an order, telling whoever was inside to come out with their hands raised. The only answer was the wind whistling through the cracks in the old wood. The lieutenant gave another order, this time to set a torch to the front wall. He would burn him out. As a soldier stepped forward with a lit torch, the stable door was kicked open from the inside. Chayton appeared in the doorway, not with his hands raised, but with the stolen rifle in his grip. He was a figure of defiance, his face set like stone, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He was not going to be taken alive. The soldiers immediately took cover, their own rifles barking, splintering the door frame around him. Chayton fired back, not wildly, but with the same deadly precision he had shown before. He was hopelessly outgunned, a single man against a squad. But he was a warrior, and he would die like one. Abigail saw it all happening as if in a terrible slow-motion dream. The flash of the rifles, the puff of smoke, the whine of the bullets. She saw Chayton, proud and fearless, choosing his end, and she could not bear it. An animal cry of desperation tore from her throat. She did not think. She only acted. She ran, her feet flying over the dusty ground, directly into the open space between the soldiers and the stable. Into the line of fire. The shooting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was shocking. She stood there, a lone figure in a simple dress, her hair coming undone in the wind, her arms spread wide. She screamed at the soldiers, her voice cracking with a grief and fury she did not know she possessed. She yelled that he is not the enemy. She screamed that we are, if we forget mercy. She turned her head to look at Chayton, her eyes pleading with him. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. The rifle in his hand slowly lowered. The fire in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, agonizing conflict. He saw the soldiers, their rifles still aimed. He saw Abigail, standing fragile and unprotected, willing to die for him. With a movement that seemed to cost him everything, he let the rifle drop to the dust. He stepped out of the shadow of the doorway, into the full, harsh light of day. He raised his empty hands slowly, his gaze never leaving Abigail's face. He had made his choice. Her life was worth more than his freedom. The soldiers converged on him immediately, their relief turning to rough anger. They bound his hands behind his back tightly, shoving him forward. As they led him away, his eyes met Abigail's one last time. There was no defeat in them, only a silent, profound message that she could not decipher, a message that broke her heart all over again. He was thrown into the small, iron-barred cell at the back of the sheriff's office. His trial was a formality. Conducted by the fort commander, he was declared an enemy combatant, a murderer, a renegade. The sentence was delivered without emotion. He was to be executed by firing squad at sunrise. That night, Abigail waited until the town was dark and silent. She crept to the sheriff's office, a small bundle in her hands. The guard at the front desk was a young private, a boy from a farm in Ohio who she had treated for a fever last month. He looked at her with pity and, after a moment's hesitation, he nodded toward the back room, then turned his attention to a newspaper, granting her a few precious, unobserved moments. The only light in the back came from a single lantern hanging on the wall, casting long, distorted shadows. Chayton was standing at the bars of his cell, as if he had been waiting for her. He was bruised from the rough handling, but he stood tall, his spirit unbowed. She came to the bars, her fingers curling around the cold iron. They were so close, yet separated by an impassable barrier. She offered him the bundle she had brought, bread and a piece of cooked meat. He shook his head. He did not need food. He only needed to look at her. She reached her hand through the bars, and he met it with his own, their fingers intertwined, a desperate final touch. His hand was warm and strong around hers. This was their only goodbye. The air was thick with all the things they had never had a chance to say. His voice was a low, steady rumble in the quiet room, devoid of fear or regret. He told her, "If I die, remember, you are already mine." Tears she had held back all day finally welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. The words were not a claim, but a statement of fact. A truth that transcended the iron bars, the sentence of death, the entire world that stood against them. She tightened her grip on his hand, her own voice a fierce, trembling whisper. She answered, "Then I will die with your name on my lips." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. It was enough. The young private cleared his throat from the other room, a gentle warning that her time was up. She pulled her hand back slowly, the loss of his touch a physical ache. She looked at him one last time, memorizing his face in the flickering lantern light. Then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her tears unshed. She did not go back to her room. She walked through the darkened streets, her mind a maelstrom of grief and rage. By the time she reached the livery stable, the storm had passed. In its place was a cold, clear, and absolute purpose. Despair had burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unshakable resolve. She would not let him die. She would not stand by and watch the world murder the only thing that had ever made her feel truly alive. She would risk treason. She would risk everything. She was going to get him out. The resolve that had settled in Abigail May's heart was a cold, hard thing, as unyielding as the iron of the cell bars that held Chayton. She moved through the darkened town, not with the frantic energy of panic, but with the chillingly precise calm of a surgeon before a difficult operation. Her first stop was not the sheriff's office, but the infirmary. She slipped inside the familiar back door, the scent of carbolic acid a strange comfort. From the locked cabinet where the poisons and potent narcotics were kept, she took a small, dark bottle of laudanum. It was a powerful tincture of opium, capable of easing great pain, and, in a high enough dose, of inducing a sleep deep enough to resemble death. Her next stop was the saloon, quiet now in the late hours. She purchased a bottle of its best whiskey, a luxury that made the bartender raise a curious eyebrow, which she ignored. With her preparations complete, she walked to the sheriff's office. Private Miller was still on duty, his youthful face pale with fatigue under the lamplight. He looked up, surprised to see her again. She offered him the bottle of whiskey, telling him it was a small thanks for his decency, a little something to ward off the night's chill. A grateful, boyish smile spread across his face. He had no reason to be suspicious of the kind nurse who had treated his fever. He thanked her profusely and, after she insisted, uncorked the bottle and took a long drink. She had already laced the contents with a heavy dose of the laudanum, enough to put a man twice his size to sleep for hours. She made small talk, her voice even and calm, asking about his family in Ohio while her mind raced, counting the seconds. She watched as he took another drink, his speech already beginning to slur slightly. He blinked, complaining that the room felt warm. Soon, his head began to nod. She gently guided him to a cot in the corner, telling him to rest his eyes for a moment. He was asleep before his head hit the thin pillow. The keys to the cell hung on a hook by the sheriff's desk. Her hand was perfectly steady as she lifted them from the wall. The metal was cold and heavy, the weight of a life in her palm. She moved to the back room, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. Chayton was awake, standing at the bars. He had not been sleeping. He had been waiting. His eyes locked with hers, and in them she saw not surprise, but a deep, knowing acceptance. He had known she would come. The key scraped in the lock, the sound deafeningly loud in the silence. The door swung open with a low groan. There was no time for words. He stepped out of the cell, and for a moment, they simply stood before each other. The reality of what they were doing a tangible presence in the small room. He touched her cheek, a brief, questioning gesture, and she leaned into his touch, a silent answer. Then they were moving, two shadows melting into the deeper darkness of the night. As if on cue, the wind began to rise. It was a low moan at first, a restless spirit stirring on the plains. By the time they reached the livery stable, it was a gathering force, whipping dust into their eyes and tugging at their clothes. Chayton moved with the certainty of a man who understood the language of the wild. He chose a horse not for its beauty, but for its strength. A big sorrel with powerful hindquarters and a calm, intelligent eye. He saddled it with practiced efficiency while Abigail retrieved a canteen of water and a small sack of dried jerky she had hidden earlier. They led the horse out the back of the stable just as the moan of the wind escalated into a full-throated howl. The sky, which had been clear, was now a sickly, churning brown. A sandstorm was upon them, a violent, blinding force of nature that would be their salvation and their torment. They mounted the horse, Abigail sitting in front of Chayton, her back pressed against the solid wall of his chest. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her secure, while his other hand took the reins. The storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. Swirling clouds of sand reduced visibility to mere feet, stinging their skin and making it impossible to breathe. The world was a maelstrom of roaring wind and flying grit. Under the cover of this chaos, they rode out of Dry Creek, unseen and unheard. Chayton guided the horse not toward the open plains, but toward the abandoned railway line that led north. Their best hope of evading a posse was to cross the deep gorge spanned by a high, skeletal trestle bridge. It was a treacherous path, but it was the one least likely to be followed. The bridge was a terrifying sight, a black skeleton against the turbulent sky. The wooden ties were spaced far apart, with sickening glimpses of the rocks and churning creek far below. The wind tore at them with a malevolent fury, trying to rip them from their perch. The horse, sensing the danger, sidestepped nervously. Chayton spoke to it in low, calm Lakota, his voice a steady anchor in the gale. He urged the horse forward, one slow, deliberate step at a time. They were halfway across when they heard the shouts behind them. A posse, alerted by the missing prisoner and the drugged guard, was pursuing them. Lanterns bobbed in the storm, their lights diffuse and ghostly in the swirling sand. A shot rang out, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Then another. A bullet whined past Abigail's ear. The horse panicked. It stumbled on a loose tie, its forelegs buckling. Abigail was thrown from the saddle, a sharp, searing pain exploding in her left leg as she hit the unforgiving timber of the bridge. The horse scrambled back to its feet, but Abigail could not stand. She looked down and saw a dark stain spreading across her dress just below the knee. A ricocheting bullet had torn a ragged gash in her calf. Chayton was off the horse in an instant, his body shielding hers from the pursuers. He fired the rifle he had retrieved from the stable, a single shot into the darkness that made the lanterns scatter. It was enough to buy them a few precious seconds. He scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, his strength a thing of awe. He abandoned the horse, running across the remaining length of the bridge, his moccasins sure-footed on the treacherous ties. He did not stop when they reached the other side, but plunged into the rocky hills, the darkness and the storm swallowing them whole. He carried her for what felt like hours. Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a dizzying swirl of pain, the feeling of Chayton's powerful arms, and the ceaseless roar of the wind. She was aware of him climbing, his breathing harsh but steady, his body a warm, solid presence in the cold, chaotic night. He found their shelter in a shallow cave carved into the face of a rocky outcrop on a place the maps called Coyote Ridge. He laid her down gently inside, out of the worst of the wind. The sandstorm began to subside, replaced by a cold, driving rain that turned the dust to mud and plastered their clothes to their skin. The rain was a blessing, washing away the grit, but it brought a new danger. A deep, shivering chill set in, and Abigail's leg throbbed with a fiery, relentless pain. The fever came on quickly. She was burning from the inside out, yet she could not stop shaking. Chayton worked with a quiet, desperate intensity. He ripped a strip from her petticoat and bound her wound tightly to stop the bleeding. Then he ventured back out into the lashing rain. He returned with a handful of roots he had dug from the rocky soil and leaves he had stripped from a hardy shrub. He chewed the leaves into a poultice and applied it to her wound, the bitter, herbal scent sharp in the air. He crushed the roots with a stone and made her drink the gritty, unpleasant mixture with water from the canteen. Her fever continued to climb. She was delirious, muttering about Boston and the infirmary, her body racked with violent shivers. Chayton built a small, smoky fire just inside the mouth of the cave, its heat a fragile defense against the cold. It was not enough. He saw that she was slipping away, her life force dwindling with every ragged breath. He lay down beside her on the cold stone floor and pulled the wolfskin blanket he had taken from the stable over both of them. Then he gathered her into his arms, pulling her shivering body against his own. He shared his warmth, his strength, his very life, willing it into her. He held her through the long, dark night, a silent guardian against the cold and the pain, his body a living shield against the death that hovered in the shadows of the cave. Abigail drifted on a dark sea of pain and fever. She was vaguely aware of a steady warmth against her back, of a strong arm holding her close. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. The fire inside her receded, leaving her weak and exhausted, but blessedly clear-headed. She opened her eyes. The rain had stopped. A small fire crackled nearby, its flames casting a warm, golden light on the stone walls of the cave. She was lying on the wolfskin blanket, and Chayton was kneeling beside her. He had taken the bandage off her leg and was gently cleaning the wound with a cloth dipped in water. His touch was incredibly tender, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched him for a long time, this man of night and wind, this warrior who had become her healer. A weak smile touched her lips. Her voice was a fragile whisper, barely more than a breath. She said, "I fixed your bullet, Graze, and now you have fixed mine." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. His dark eyes, so often fierce and wild, were soft in the firelight. He set aside the cloth and moved closer. He gently placed his hand not on her wound, not on her forehead, but flat against her chest, directly over her heart. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her dress. His voice was low and resonant, filled with a truth that settled deep in her soul. He said, "No, Mrs. Mine, I fixed your name." The words hung in the quiet air of the cave, more real and binding than any vow spoken in a church. Abigail May looked at Chayton, at the man who had laid his hand over her heart and claimed her not as a possession, but as a destiny fulfilled. In the warm glow of the small fire, the grime, the blood, and the fear of the past days seemed to recede, leaving only the profound, unshakable truth of their connection. She was weak, her body ached, and her leg throbbed with a dull, persistent fire. But for the first time since leaving Boston, her soul felt anchored. They spent the day in the relative safety of the cave. Chayton tended to her leg with a gentle expertise that belied the warrior's strength in his hands. He fashioned a crutch for her from a sturdy branch and shared the last of their dried meat. They spoke little, but their silence was a comfortable language now, a shared space of understanding. Outside, the world was washed clean by the rain, the air crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. A fragile peace settled upon them, a stolen moment of tranquility in a world that wanted them dead. The peace was shattered by a scent on the wind. It was faint at first, a distant, acrid smell that was not of the clean earth or the pines. Chayton was on his feet in an instant, his body taut, his head raised like a deer sensing a predator. He moved to the mouth of the cave, his eyes scanning the wooded ridge below them. Abigail saw the muscles in his back tense. He came back to her, his face grim. The scent was smoke, too much smoke. It was not a campfire, it was the smell of a forest burning. He told her they could not stay. The posse had not given up. They had circled the ridge and were setting fires along the base. Using the wind to drive the flames uphill, they meant to flush them out like animals from their den, to force them into the open. The fire was not just a weapon. It was a wall, closing in, stealing the very air from their lungs. Their desperate flight began anew. The journey down the far side of the ridge was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Abigail leaned heavily on her crutch and on Chayton, every step sending a jolt of pain up her leg. The smoke grew thicker, a choking gray fog that stung their eyes and clawed at their throats. The sound of the fire was a constant, growing roar, a hungry beast consuming everything in its path. They reached the flatlands below the ridge just as the flames crested the summit behind them, a terrifying wall of orange and red against the afternoon sky. The world before them was a scene of utter devastation. The fire had already passed through here, leaving behind a blackened, smoking plain. The ground was hot to the touch, covered in a fine layer of gray ash that rose in ghostly clouds with every step. The charred skeletons of trees reached toward the sky like blackened fingers. The air was thick with the smell of cinders and ruin. They ran through this hellish landscape, two small figures against a backdrop of apocalyptic destruction. There was no cover, no place to hide. They were completely exposed. It was in this desolate wasteland that the posse finally caught up to them. They heard the horses first, the drumming of hooves on the hard-packed earth. 3 riders broke through the haze of smoke, their figures wavering in the heat. They were no longer a disciplined squad, but hunters closing in for the final moment. Chayton pushed Abigail behind him, shoving the heavy rifle into her hands. He told her to run toward the distant line of hills while he held them off. She shook her head, her hand gripping his arm. She would not leave him. There was no time to argue. Two of the riders fanned out, attempting to circle them, while one, a burly man with a thick red beard, charged straight toward them, his pistol raised. Chayton met the charge, pulling a long knife from his belt. But the man was on horseback, his advantage absolute. Abigail watched, her heart seizing with terror. This was the end. They had come so far, only to die here in the ash. The rider reined in his horse a dozen yards away, the animal snorting and stamping nervously. He leveled his pistol, taking careful aim at Chayton. In that moment, something inside Abigail shifted. The gentle, healing hands of the nurse clenched around the hard wood and cold steel of the rifle. The part of her that set bones and stitched wounds, the part that had sworn an oath to preserve life, was eclipsed by a fierce, primal instinct to protect it, to protect his life. She raised the rifle. It was heavy, unwieldy in her arms. She had never fired a gun before. She did not aim. She did not think. She simply pointed the barrel in the direction of the threat and pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a violent kick against her shoulder that nearly knocked her off her feet. The sound was deafening. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw the man with the red beard cry out, his pistol flying from his hand as he clutched his leg. He toppled sideways from his horse, landing in a heap on the ashen ground. She had not killed him, but she had stopped him. She stood frozen, the rifle still smoking in her hands, her mind reeling from what she had done. The healer had become a fighter. Before the other two riders could react, a fourth horseman appeared, riding hard through the smoke. It was Sheriff O'Donnell. He skidded to a halt between his men and the two fugitives. His hand raised, he surveyed the scene with his weary, assessing eyes the wounded man on the ground, Chayton standing over Abigail with his knife drawn, and Abigail herself, a strange, fierce figure holding a rifle, her face streaked with soot and a terrible, newfound resolve. The two posse members looked at their sheriff, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. They wanted blood, but O'Donnell only looked at Abigail and Chayton. He saw not a renegade and his traitorous accomplice. He saw two people who had fought through fire and chaos, who had refused to be broken. He saw the way Chayton stood, ready to die for her, and the way she held the rifle, ready to kill for him. He saw something that the law books in his office had no words for. He made his decision. He looked at his men and ordered them to tend to their wounded companion. Then he turned his horse and rode a few paces closer to Abigail and Chayton. He did not raise his voice. He spoke quietly, his words almost lost in the wind. He looked at Abigail, and there was no condemnation in his eyes, only a profound, heartbreaking weariness. He told them to go, and to never look back. He said that he would report that they had died in the fire. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of the choice she had made and the conscience he had chosen not to shoot. Then he turned his horse and, without a backward glance, led his men away, their forms quickly swallowed by the smoke. They were alone. They were free. They walked for days, heading north and west, into the high country. Abigail's legs slowly began to heal, the wound closing, the pain receding to a dull ache. Chayton knew the land, knew how to find clean water and edible plants. He hunted with a bow and arrows he fashioned himself, and they survived. The world of Dry Creek, of Boston, of everything she had ever known, faded behind them like a distant dream. They found his people in a hidden valley deep in the mountains. It was not the proud, thriving nation he had described from his memories of the Black Hills. It was a refugee camp, a small, sad collection of teepees and makeshift shelters. These were the survivors, the remnants of a people pushed to the very edge of existence. They were thin and their eyes held the haunted look of those who had lost everything. But they were alive. They took Chayton in with a quiet, solemn joy. They called him Falcon, a name spoken with reverence. They looked at Abigail with a guarded curiosity. She was the enemy, a white woman in a place where white men had brought only suffering. But she was Chayton's woman, and for his sake, they offered her a place by their fire. A new kind of struggle began for Abigail, a battle fought not with guns or fire, but within the quiet confines of her own heart. She lived among the Lakota, learning their ways, their language, their deep, abiding connection to the earth. She admired their resilience, their generosity, their dignity in the face of annihilation. But she could not forget who she was. She was a woman raised on brick streets, educated in sterile lecture halls, a woman who had once believed in the unassailable righteousness of her own civilization. She was an alien, a ghost from another world. She belonged neither here in this camp of survivors, nor back in the world that had tried to kill the man she loved. She was caught between two shores, with no bridge to either. Chayton saw the conflict in her eyes, the sadness that sometimes clouded her face as she stared into the fire at night. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the valley, he led her to a high bluff that overlooked the camp. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of orange, pink, and gold. The wind whispered through the tall pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of a ceremonial drum. He stood before her, his face serious in the fading light. He did not speak of marriage in the way she understood it. Instead, he began a ritual. He took from a small leather pouch a circlet woven from sweetgrass, and tied to it was a single, perfect eagle feather. He told her the eagle flew highest, that it saw all things, that its feather was a connection to the Great Spirit. It was a symbol of honor, of truth, of courage. He held it out to her, not as a gift, but as an offering. He spoke to her in the soft, flowing sounds of his own tongue, his voice a solemn vow carried on the wind. Then he looked into her eyes and translated the heart of his words. He was not offering her a home in his world or asking her to join his people. He was offering to build a new world with her, a world of their own, a place where their two spirits could be one. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as she looked at him, at the eagle feather, at the vast, beautiful, and terrifying wilderness that was now her life. The war inside her ceased. The woman she had been, the nurse from Boston with her proper notions and her broken engagement, had died in the fire on the plains. She had been forged into someone new. She reached out and took the circlet from his hands. Her voice was steady and clear, filled with a certainty that was as vast as the western sky. She told him, "I came west to find myself, and I found my name instead." A year passed in the hidden valley. It was a time of quiet healing, a year measured in the turning of seasons rather than the ticking of a clock. Abigail May learned the rhythm of a life dictated by the sun and the snow. Her hands, once accustomed to sterile bandages and bottles of antiseptic, grew skilled at grinding corn, tanning hides, and identifying the healing properties of wild herbs. The jagged wound in her soul, the feeling of being an outcast caught between two worlds, slowly began to scar over, replaced by a quiet strength. Chayton was her anchor, her teacher, her husband in all but a name her former world would recognize. The eagle feather he had given her was a constant presence, a reminder of the vow they had made under the setting sun. The world of Dry Creek was a distant, painful memory, a chapter she believed was closed forever. But the West was a small place, and news traveled on the wind, carried by trappers and traders who moved between the isolated pockets of civilization and the vast, unmapped wilderness. The news came with a French trapper named Pierre, a man whose loyalty was to beaver pelts, not governments. He shared his campfire with Chayton's people for a night, and he shared his stories. He spoke of a town called Dry Creek, a town that was rotting from the inside out. The federal marshal, Gage, the man with the cold eyes and the stolen gold, had taken complete control. He had used his star and the gold to buy the loyalty of a dozen ruthless men. He had accused Sheriff O'Donnell of incompetence and conspiracy in the escape of a renegade, and had him formally dismissed by a territorial judge who was also on his payroll. Dry Creek was now Gage's personal fiefdom. The saloon was open day and night. The general store's prices were whatever Gage's men decided they were, and the women of the town walked the streets with their eyes downcast, their fear a palpable thing. Abigail listened to the trapper's words, and a cold dread seeped into her bones, extinguishing the peace she had so carefully cultivated. She saw the faces of the people she had treated the blacksmith's wife, the baker whose son Chayton had saved, the young soldiers at the fort who were just boys far from home. She had abandoned them. She had run to save one life, and had left an entire community to fester under the thumb of a tyrant. That night, she could not sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, the eagle feather in her hand. Chayton came and sat beside her, his presence a silent question. She told him what was in her heart. She said that she had to go back. He listened, his face an unreadable mask in the moonlight. He reminded her that to them, she was a ghost. She had died in the fire. To return was to invite a new death, a real one. She met his gaze, her own resolve as hard as the mountain stone around them. She told him that a ghost cannot feel the pain of others, and she felt their pain as if it were her own. Her work in Dry Creek was not finished. She was a healer, and that town was sick with a poison she had unintentionally helped to unleash. She told him she would go alone if she must, but she had to go. He looked at her for a long time, at the woman who had run into a line of fire for him, and he nodded. Her people were now his people. Her fight was now his fight. Their return to Dry Creek was a journey into a dying land. They traveled by night, two shadows moving through a world they no longer belonged to. When they first saw the town from the crest of the familiar ridge, it was as if a sickness had taken root and leached the life from it. The buildings seemed to sag, their paint peeled, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The once bustling street was nearly empty, save for a few of Gage's men lounging on the porch of the saloon, their rifles held with a lazy arrogance. They entered the town after midnight, slipping through the darkness to the small property she had once rented. The house was empty, the door unlocked and swinging on one hinge. The abandoned stable where their story had truly begun was a collapsed ruin of charred timbers, burned by the posse as O'Donnell had predicted. They took shelter in the small, musty root cellar beneath her old house, a dark, cramped space that would be their hidden base. The next day, Abigail emerged from the cellar alone, her hair tucked under a simple bonnet, her face pale but determined. She walked directly to the infirmary. It was filthy, neglected, the shelves half empty. She started to clean. She swept the floors, washed the grimy windows, and organized the meager remaining supplies. People saw the light in the infirmary window, and slowly, cautiously, they began to come. At first, it was as if they were seeing an apparition. The blacksmith's wife clutched her heart and whispered Abigail's name like a prayer. The stories of her return spread through the town in hushed, excited whispers. She did not explain where she had been. She simply went back to work. She treated a child burning with fever. She stitched a gash on a rancher's hand. She put a soothing balm on the bruised cheek of a woman who claimed she had walked into a door, but whose eyes told a different story. With every small act of healing, she was weaving herself back into the fabric of the community. The respect she had once commanded returned, stronger now, tinged with a sense of awe. She was the woman who had come back, a symbol of a time before Gage, a flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness. Chayton remained hidden, a phantom who emerged only at night to bring her food and to watch over the town from the shadows. His presence was a secret she guarded with every fiber of her being. But secrets, as the old sheriff had said, have a way of leaving a trail. It was a child who betrayed them, unintentionally. The baker's son, the boy Chayton had saved from the fire, was playing near the ruins of the old stable. He saw a man's figure slip into the root cellar, a man with long, dark hair who moved with the grace of a hunting cat. He ran to his father, excitedly telling him that the guardian spirit of the town had returned. The baker, his heart filled with a superstitious gratitude, told his wife, and his wife, in a moment of unguarded relief, mentioned it to a neighbor while drawing water from the well. The whisper found its way, as all whispers do, to the ears of one of Gage's men. They came for him at dusk. Gage himself led them, his cold eyes alight with a triumphant cruelty. They surrounded the small house, their rifles aimed at the cellar doors. Gage called for him to come out, his voice dripping with mockery. When Chayton did not emerge, they ripped the doors from their hinges and descended into the darkness. He did not fight. There was nowhere to run, and he would not endanger Abigail. They dragged him out into the fading light, his hands bound behind his back. Gage smiled, a thin, ugly expression. He declared to the townspeople who had begun to gather that he had finally caught the renegade, the murderer who had been hiding among them, aided by the traitorous nurse. He announced that justice would be swift. They would build a gallows in the center of the town square. At noon the next day, everyone would witness the end of the Lakota menace. The next morning, the crude wooden gallows stood like a skeletal accusation in the heart of Dry Creek. Gage's men herded the townsfolk into the square, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a deep, simmering resentment. Abigail stood in the crowd, her face a pale, emotionless mask, her heart a block of ice. They brought Chayton out and forced him up the steps of the gallows. He did not struggle. He stood straight and proud, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, finally resting on Abigail. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, final message of love. Gage stepped forward, enjoying his moment of absolute power. He began to speak, his voice loud and arrogant, about law and order, about the dangers of the savage, about the justice he was bringing to their town. The crowd was silent, their heads bowed. It was into this charged silence that Abigail's voice rang out, clear and strong, not a shout, but a statement of unshakable truth that cut through Gage's speech. She called him a liar. Every head snapped up. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Gage stopped speaking, his face contorting with rage as he stared at her. Abigail pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her eyes blazing with a fire that was more powerful than any weapon. She pointed a finger at Chayton. She said that everyone thought he was the enemy. They looked at his skin and they saw a savage. But she looked at that man, and she saw the one who had saved the baker's son from the church fire. Then she turned her finger, slowly, deliberately, and pointed it at Gage. She told the crowd to look at the man with the star. He had told them he was hunting a renegade. He had lied. He was hunting gold. She told them he had killed the United States soldiers on the payroll wagon, their soldiers, and he had stolen their gold to buy his power, to buy the guns that now held them all hostage. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Her words were a spark landing on dry tinder. Gage sputtered, calling her a delusional woman, ordering his men to seize her. But his men hesitated, their eyes darting nervously at the faces of the townspeople, faces that were no longer just afraid, but were hardening with a cold, dawning anger. A voice cut through the tension, a voice as dry and weary as the dust on the street. It said, "That is far enough, Gage." The crowd parted. Standing at the edge of the square, a rifle held loosely in his hands, was former Sheriff O'Donnell. He was no longer wearing a star, but he looked more like a lawman than Gage ever had. Gage's face went pale. He drew his pistol, a panicked, clumsy movement. But O'Donnell was faster. The old sheriff's rifle cracked once. Gage staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his silver star. He fell from the gallows and did not move again. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. Gage's men, their leader dead, tried to assert control, but the spell of fear was broken. The blacksmith, letting out a roar of pent-up rage, charged forward, swinging a heavy hammer. Other men joined him, their fear transformed into a righteous fury. In the ensuing pandemonium, O'Donnell calmly climbed the steps of the gallows and used his knife to cut Chayton's bonds. When the dust settled, Gage and his men were either dead, captured, or had fled into the plains. The town of Dry Creek belonged to its people again. They did not cheer. A quiet, sober atmosphere filled the square. They gathered around the gallows. But they did not look at Gage's body. They looked at Chayton and Abigail. The blacksmith, his face grim with a newfound respect, stepped forward. He looked at Chayton, not as a Lakota, not as a fugitive, but as something else entirely. He said, his voice ringing out for all to hear, that he had saved his boy. He was the guardian of Dry Creek. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. For the first time, they were not just protecting Abigail's secret. They were protecting him. He was one of them. The fragile peace that settled over Dry Creek in the wake of Gage's demise was short-lived. The town had cleansed itself of one poison, but the law, a slow and ponderous beast, was stirring in the territorial capital of Cheyenne. News of a federal marshal's death, a prison break, and a civilian uprising had reached the governor. An official inquiry was unavoidable. A circuit judge was dispatched to impose order, to untangle the messy knot of frontier justice and replace it with the cold, hard letter of the law. The trial was held in the saloon, the only building large enough to accommodate the entire town. The tables were pushed against the walls, and the air, usually thick with the smell of stale whiskey and sawdust, was now heavy with a nervous, sober silence. Judge Alistair Blackwood was a man carved from the eastern granite of the law. He was old, with a mane of white hair and a face etched with the stern lines of a man who had spent a lifetime weighing the sins of others. He sat behind the bar, which now served as his bench, his black robes a stark, incongruous sight against the backdrop of whiskey bottles and brass spittoons. He was flanked by a humorless military prosecutor, a Captain Davies, whose uniform was as starched and rigid as his view of the world. Abigail May and Chayton stood before him. The accused, they were not in chains, a small concession granted by former Sheriff O'Donnell, who now stood with the townspeople, a silent, watchful presence. Chayton was a pillar of calm defiance, his hands unbound, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the saloon walls. He wore the simple deerskin leggings and shirt of a Lakota warrior, the eagle feather circlet a symbol of a world this court could not comprehend. Abigail stood beside him, her dress clean but worn, her hands clasped before her face pale but her eyes clear and steady. Captain Davies began, his voice a dry monotone as he laid out the case for the prosecution. The facts, he argued, were simple and irrefutable. The woman, Abigail May, a nurse in the employ of the United States Army, did knowingly harbor and give aid to an enemy combatant. The Lakota renegade known as Chayton, he presented evidence of her deception, her theft of Army medical supplies, her drugging of a federal guard. He then pointed to Chayton, describing him as a known murderer of soldiers and prospectors, a fugitive from justice. He concluded by stating that their actions, culminating in a violent prison break, had directly led to the death of a federal marshal and instigated a civilian insurrection. The charges were treason, conspiracy, and murder. The penalty, he stated without emotion, was death by hanging. The words fell into the silent room, each one a hammer blow. The case, as he presented it, was airtight, a perfect, logical construction of law and fact that left no room for doubt, and no room for mercy. When he had finished, Judge Blackwood looked at Abigail. He asked if she had anything to say in her defense. He had expected a plea for leniency, perhaps a tearful confession. He was not prepared for the quiet, unshakable strength in her voice as she said that she would speak for them both. She did not deny the facts. She did not dispute a single point the prosecutor had made. Instead, she began to tell a story. She started not with a bullet graze, but with a journey, a young woman from Boston coming west in search of a freedom she had never known. She spoke of the ambush on the stagecoach and of her first lesson in Western justice, when she was chastised for saving the life of a small, wounded Lakota boy, Coda. She then spoke of the night she had found Chayton, bleeding and near death by the well. She looked directly at the judge. She said that Captain Davies called him an enemy combatant, but she had seen only a human being in agony. She said her oath as a nurse did not ask the name or the allegiance of the suffering. It simply commanded her to heal. To have left him to die would not have been an act of patriotism. It would have been a betrayal of her own soul. She spoke of the days in the stable, of the man who had lost his home, his family, his entire world. The blacksmith and the baker nodded slowly, their face grim with a new understanding. She described the raid on Dry Creek, not by a Lakota warrior, but by the very man the prosecutor now mourned, the man with the silver star. She told them all how a single, precise rifle shot from the stable hayloft had saved a child from the church fire, an act not of a renegade, but of a guardian. The baker stood up, his voice trembling but loud. He confirmed that it was true, that his boy would have died that day. Judge Blackwood silenced him with a look, but he made a note on the paper before him. Abigail's voice grew stronger, imbued with a passion that held the entire room captive. She pointed at the recovered Army payroll box, which now sat as evidence. She said that was the reason Marshal Gage had come to their town, the reason he had killed their soldiers. She had not incited a rebellion. She had simply told the truth. The people of Dry Creek had not risen against the law. They had risen against a tyrant who wore the law as a mask. She finally turned to the heart of the matter, the charge of treason, the accusation that her actions were a betrayal of her country. She took a step forward, her eyes locking with the judge's, her gaze so intense that he seemed to lean back in his chair. Her voice, when she spoke again, was not loud, but it filled every corner of the saloon. She said, "Love is no rebellion. Sir, it is the only law older than your country." A profound, absolute silence descended upon the room. The words echoed, settling into the hearts of the rough men and weary women who had lived their lives by a simpler, harsher code. The prosecutor, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. His neat, logical case undone by a truth that defied legal definition. Chayton, who had remained still and silent, slowly turned his head and looked at Abigail, and in his eyes was a look of such profound love and awe that it was more powerful than any testimony. Judge Blackwood stared at her for a long, long time. He looked from her face to Chayton's, then out at the sea of faces in the crowd, faces that were no longer just spectators, but a jury, and their verdict was already written in their eyes. He had come west to impose the law, but he was learning that justice in this land was a far more complicated thing. It was not found in books, but in the actions of people pushed to the very edge of their humanity. He finally cleared his throat and rendered his judgment. His voice was heavy, thoughtful. He acknowledged the truth of the prosecutor's facts. He stated that by the strict letter of the law, Abigail May and the man Chayton were guilty of numerous, serious crimes. However, he continued, the law also made provision for extraordinary circumstances. He cited their heroic role in exposing and dispatching a corrupt federal official. He cited the unified testimony of the entire community. He ruled that their actions, while illegal, were not born of malice or treasonous intent, but of a fundamental and necessary pursuit of justice and the preservation of life. He declared them acquitted of all charges. A collective sigh of relief, followed by a low, rumbling cheer, went through the crowd. Judge Blackwood banged a whiskey bottle on the bar for order. He had one final piece of business. He declared that in recognition of his defense of the town, the man Chayton was granted the right of permanent, peaceful residence within the township of Dry Creek, under the protection of its laws. They did not stay in the saloon to celebrate. They walked out into the clean, bright sunlight, into the embrace of the townspeople who now saw them not as a scandal, but as a symbol of their own resilience. Their wedding was not held in the burned-out church or in the judge's makeshift court. It took place a few days later, beside the clear, flowing creek that gave the town its name. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by a few of their closest friends, the blacksmith and his wife, the baker and his son, and former Sheriff O'Donnell. Abigail wore a simple white dress, and instead of a veil, she had a single, perfect white prairie flower tucked into her hair. Chayton stood beside her, the eagle feather circlet around his neck, a stark and beautiful symbol of his heritage against his dark skin. There was no preacher, no book of common prayer. They simply stood before their friends and joined hands. O'Donnell, acting as a witness for their new world, spoke a few simple words about finding peace in a hard land. They did not exchange rings. Instead, Chayton gently touched the flower in her hair, and she, in turn, touched the eagle feather at his neck. It was a silent acknowledgement, a binding of two worlds, two souls, two lives, made not with gold, but with the fragile, beautiful things of the earth. As they stood by the water, the final words of the trial came back to Abigail. Judge Blackwood, in his concluding summary, had looked out at the silent courtroom. His gaze had settled on the two of them, and he had spoken a sentence that was not recorded in the official transcript, but that every person in that room would remember. He said that she fixed his bullet, Graze. He fixed her name. It was no longer the delirious rambling of a fevered man. It was the truth. It was the definition of their love, a law unto itself, forged in the heart of the Wild West. The years, like the creek that gave the town its name, flowed on. They cut new channels, smoothed the sharpest stones, and turned the hard, raw dirt of memory into the fertile soil of a legend. The dry creek that had been a single, dusty street of fear and suspicion was gone, washed away by the steady current of time. In its place stood a town, a proper town, with a sturdy new church whose steeple was the tallest thing for 100 miles, a brick schoolhouse that echoed with the shouts and laughter of children, and a general store that had grown to 2 stories. The clatter of the telegraph office was a constant, chattering pulse, connecting them to the world they had once felt so cut off from. Wagons rumbled down the main street, but they were no longer just army supply trains or the coaches of terrified travelers. They were farm wagons, piled high with corn and squash, and the buckboards of ranchers coming in for supplies. And sometimes they were the travois of the Lakota, who would come down from the high valleys to trade. They would walk the streets of Dry Creek not as enemies or ghosts, but as neighbors. The past was not forgotten. It was a landscape of scars that everyone shared, but the wounds had finally, blessedly, closed. At the west end of town, where the creek bent toward the hills, stood a house. It was built of cottonwood and river stone, solid and welcoming, with a wide porch and windows that were always clean. A small garden grew beside it, filled with the practical greens of the kitchen and the vibrant, stubborn beauty of prairie flowers. Over the door hung a simple wooden sign, the letters carved with care and painted a deep, abiding blue. The sign did not bear a doctor's shingle or a government seal. It said, simply Mrs. Mind's Healing House. Here, Abigail May, her hair now a river of silver woven with threads of its old brown, practiced a kind of medicine that was not taught in Boston lecture halls. She still set bones and stitched wounds, her hands as steady as they had ever been. But her healing now went deeper. She was a physician of the soul as much as the body. She was the calm voice that soothed a feverish child, the quiet presence that sat with a grieving widow, the steady hand that offered a cup of herbal tea to a young Lakota woman homesick for the mountains. In her house, there was no white, no native, only the sick and the healing. She had become the conscience of the town, not a thing to be shot, but the bedrock on which its new life was built. And Chayton, the falcon, the phantom warrior, had found a new kind of freedom, The restless energy that had once driven him to vengeance had softened, deepened into a profound, quiet wisdom. The lines around his eyes were no longer etched by sorrow, but by the sun and the wind and the crinkle of frequent laughter. His hands, which had known the cold feel of a rifle and a knife, now knew the warmth of a child's small hand placed in his. He was the town's horseman, its storyteller, its living link to the wild land they all inhabited. The children adored him. They would gather at his feet in the long, golden afternoons, a mix of settler towheads and black-haired Lakota boys and girls, and listen to his stories. He never spoke of the battles, of the blood and the fire. He spoke of the world as he knew it, of the cleverness of the coyote, the courage of the eagle, the strength of the buffalo. He taught them how to read the clouds, how to listen to the wind, how to ride a pony as if they were a part of the horse itself. His most beloved stories were what the children called the tales of wounds and grace. He would tell them of a great wound that could not be healed by medicine alone, a wound of loss and anger, and he would tell them of an unexpected grace, a small act of mercy from an enemy. That was the only balm powerful enough to make a soul whole again. The children would listen, their eyes wide, not understanding all the words, but understanding the truth in his voice. They did not know the story was his own. They only knew that it made them feel brave and kind. He and Abigail lived in a comfortable, easy silence, their lives woven together so tightly that they seemed to breathe with a single breath. He would watch her from the porch as she tended her garden, and she would watch him from the window of her clinic as he taught a child to post a trot. In the evenings, they would sit together, her hand resting on his, and watch the stars appear in the vast, dark sky, a silent testament to the universe they had built together out of the wreckage of their separate worlds. The story of their past had become the town's founding myth. The old-timers, the blacksmith and the baker, their own hair now white, would tell the tale to newcomers over a beer at the saloon. They would talk of the time when the town was ruled by fear, of the fire, and of the woman who had walked into a hail of bullets to save the man she loved. They would speak with the reverence of the guardian of Dry Creek, the Lakota warrior who had adopted their town as his own. The story had lost its sharp, painful edges over the years. The terror and the bloodshed had faded, and what remained was the simple, powerful truth of it, a tale of courage, of mercy, and of a love that had been strong enough to heal not just a bullet graze, but an entire community. People often said that the nurse from the east had saved the Lakota warrior, that she had fixed his wound and given him a new life. It was a good story, and it was true, as far as it went, but they had only seen the beginning. They had not seen the frightened young woman who had fled a gilded cage in Boston, a woman who had come west seeking a freedom she could not define, a woman whose own soul was quietly bleeding from a life she had not chosen. They had not understood that in healing him, she had found the cure for her own affliction. They said she fixed his wound, but the real truth, the truth that lived in the quiet spaces between their heartbeats, was that he had fixed her soul. One evening, in the autumn of their lives, Abigail stood on the small hill behind their house, the same hill from which she had once watched a town consumed by fire. The wind, her old, constant companion, was blowing gently from the east, rustling the dry prairie grass and tugging at the threads of her silver hair. She wore a simple white dress, and she stood looking out at the world they had made. She saw the lights of the town twinkling on as dusk began to fall. She saw the creek, a silver ribbon in the fading light. She looked out toward the distant, unseen Dakota lands, toward the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and fiery red. The view was no longer filled with fear or uncertainty, but with a deep and abiding peace. From the house below, she heard his voice, a faint and distant call, as much a part of the landscape as the wind itself. It was the name that had been spoken first in fever and delirium, a name whispered in a dark stable amidst a storm, a name declared in a silent cave, a name that had been her anchor and her truth. It was the name the wind itself seemed to whisper as it passed over the plains. "Mrs. Mine," Her gaze fell upon the creek below. The last brilliant light of the evening fell upon the water, and for a moment the creek did not reflect the dying gold of sunset, but the fierce, promising red of a new dawn. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.